Welcome back to Propaganda by the Seed with your hosts, Tim Holland and Aaron Parker. Aaron, how's it going, man?
It's going pretty good, all things considered. Definitely got some apocalypse anxiety here and there, but hanging in there. And really, my situation is so much better than most people's that can't hardly complain.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I keep saying is that, like, you know, as someone who's just been, like, thinking about the end of the world for, you know, whatever, my whole life, when I'm, you know, faced with a situation like we're faced with, I find myself feeling like I'm caught flat-footed or something. Like, I thought I had thought about this, but I'd never thought very much about pandemics. I didn't see it as a very likely threat to our way of life. And, yeah, it's surreal to me. Like, you know, watching Trump yesterday say everybody's going to be back to work by Easter, I just felt like I was in a horror movie. You know, I was like, this is like a scene in a fucking horror movie. It's crazy.
Yeah. That's something. It's not even optimism, because there are people who are basically just talking about, like, letting millions of people die so that the economy doesn't slow down. I don't know. That's one of the more surreal aspects of it for me, for sure.
But yeah, again, we don't have to get all into it, but it just really highlights, like, just how it's always like just short-term profits are the only thing they care about, because obviously, like, whatever short-term gains are made, having like a pandemic become just a national deathscape or whatever, will not be good for their beloved economy, and they're going to get the worst of both worlds. And it's shocking to me that we have such an idiot in charge of our country right now. It's fucking crazy.
Yeah, pretty bizarre.
But it's a good time to plant a garden. Maybe never
definitely a good time to plant a garden, and it sounds like a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise be gardening or have thought about growing a garden for a long time are going to be doing it this season. So I thought it would be cool to start off this episode with the basic stuff for people who aren't really familiar with gardening, in case they want to get into gardening this season at any kind of scale, because, you know, not every, you know, put an acre into cultivation right now, but even if it's just like a little pot of microgreens, or if it is an acre or more, or whatever, it's an important time to be putting some seeds in the soil and growing something to feed yourself and your friends and your community and your family.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I often, you know, talk about my beloved cold frames, but, you know, I have some cold frames, which is like it's like a raised bed, but you put a window on it, so it extends the growing season, you know, 2 months in the front, 2 months in behind. But just in the 16-foot by 2-foot cold frames I have, I get so much food out of them. They in some ways they outperform other parts of my garden, or even with just a couple beds with just some greens and tomatoes, and like you can really feed yourself and eat well with very little effort. So it's a good time to talk about this stuff. But before we get into it, Aaron, you know, you're self-employed. You run a nursery and company specializing in perennial vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, vines, etc.
Yep, all things unusual edible.
And but if people are into what you're talking about and they, you know, want to get some awesome plants, do you still have the discount going with the Soulcast stuff on your store?
I do. So if you want to buy some stuff from me, awesome. For me, Edgewood Nursery, or I'm sorry, Edgewood-nursery.com. And if you use the code SOLECAST, SOLECAST, at checkout, you can get 10% off. And I've got all sorts of seeds and tubers for planting, and I just started shipping plants a few days ago. So there'll be lots more plants available soon as the rest of the nursery kind of thaws out and comes to life. So check back in a few days. You'll likely have even more selection.
But then you also have the edible flower packs, edible perennial vegetable like package deals. So if people are like curious and just want to try a couple different things, those are available too. And one of the things that you push that I wasn't that excited about until I grew it was the bee balm that tastes like oregano. That shit is incredible. Like, I'm growing way more of it this year because just as like a culinary spice, it's incredible.
Nice.
The Monarda, whatever.
Yeah, I love all the different types of bee balm.
Yeah. Okay, so that's enough self-promo. If you want to support this podcast, hit up Edgewood Nursery. It's a good time to plant a garden. So for people who are thinking about it, which a lot of people are right now, what do you think is the best way for folks to get started?
Well, the thing that I often tell people to start with is looking at the landscape that they live in and trying to identify all of the common plants in it. And then looking at whether those plants are already edible. Because there's a lot of really good edible plants that people, or specifically Americans, don't realize are edible. And the most obvious one for me is the dandelion. They grow all over the place, up through a crack in the asphalt, to growing out of a wall, or wherever there's some sun, dandelions there, and they really are an excellent edible. Most people are familiar with eating the leaves, but the whole plant's edible, and the flowers are actually my favorite part of the dandelion. And there's lots of other ones that are just as common. Hosta is a really great spring vegetable. Clover, violets, are all, either common weeds or commonly cultivated as ornamentals like hosta. So it's a good idea to try and, just survey your landscape and figure out what's already there, because it'd be a shame to rip out a big bed of hosta because you thought it was, just sort of a useless ornamental, when that's actually a really good perennial vegetable. So that's step number one, in my opinion.
Also, I'd like to shout out Purslane, Lamb's Quarter, on my property that, be evening primrose or cattails, and maybe fiddleheads from Lucky. But yeah, so it's like,
totally.
Picking up a forager book for where you live, or at least like hitting up some forum to discover like what people are foraging where you live is, you'll discover all kinds of shit.
Yeah, those are great resources. Also, there's a website called Eat the Weeds. That's really well done, and a nice introduction for a lot of that stuff. And lots of forums, like groups on Facebook and stuff like that. If you have trouble identifying some of the plants, there's lots of places on the internet where people will be totally happy to help you figure out what that plant is. So once you've figured out what's already there, assuming that you don't have a fully planted edible forest garden that you just didn't know about. You're probably going to want to grow some new plants, and I thought we should talk a little bit about the different ways of doing that, because there's a big difference between plants that are what's called direct sown, which is when you take a seed and put it straight into its final growing position, or plants that are transplanted, which means that you would start your seeds in a pot, and that could be indoors under lights, or indoors in a south-facing window if you're in the northern hemisphere, because different plants need different sort of cultural conditions. So you need to know a little bit about the differences for that. And then there's also, you can buy already grown plants at a local nursery or an online nursery like from me, or potentially get them from friends who might have extra seedlings to share.
Yeah, or, like in Maine, we're able to go to like the MOFGA site, and it gives you like a whole table of like when to plant cabbage if you're going to transplant it out, when to plant onions, when to plant tomatoes. And so it's definitely not too late in the growing season for most people. I mean, even in Colorado, people don't really even plant tomatoes until June. So you still have time to start some tomatoes indoors and get them outside. And it seems like tomatoes and onions are the ones that like the most lead time as far as the annual common vegetables. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, definitely. Peppers too. But for tomatoes, let's say I just planted my tomatoes like last week. Although obviously, if you're in the deep south or something, you probably should have planted tomatoes a while ago. So it is pretty variable. But for people in the northern U.S. or similar climates, now is a perfectly good time to get started with just about anything. So it's definitely not too late. Some really basic resources for figuring out whether any given crop should be direct sown or transplanted is the Fedco Seeds Catalogue. Sort of in the middle of the catalog, there's a table that tells you whether they would recommend direct sowing, transplanting the seeds, how deep they should be sown, and what time of year they should be sown. And that's mostly geared towards a climate similar to Maine. But if you're somewhere else, you can extrapolate a little bit and kind of, if you're mid-Atlantic or south, maybe subtract a month or so from the recommendations. But that's just kind of a nice one-page summation of a lot of basic planting information. It also tells you about like row spacing and stuff like that, which may or may not be applicable depending on your garden layout. But I've found Fedco's descriptions of how to grow most crops that are kind of in the catalog to be really useful and pretty comprehensible to people who aren't familiar with gardening jargon. And it's a free resource that is available online real easy.
That's awesome. We'll link it in the show notes. And it's just a fun catalog too. It has a lot of character and spunk.
Yeah. Fedco, also a good place to buy seeds. So once you've figured out what you would like to be growing in your garden, whether that's annuals or perennials, is going to make a big difference. And I am usually an advocate for planting as many perennials as possible. But this year, because there is this sort of looming specter of there might be shortages of some things, food might not be as accessible. A lot of people are losing their jobs. You might not have as much money to spend on food. You might potentially have more time to put into growing some food, because while gardening is something I really enjoy, and there are ways to do it that kind of minimize the amount of effort that it takes and minimize the amount of materials that it needs. Without investing some materials and some labor, you're basically not going to get anything. So it's not, it takes an input of time to get something back, and that return can be really great if it's done thoughtfully and carefully.
I'll just jump in real quick. But one thing I will say is, having had a tiny garden, 1/32 of an acre or something in Denver, and most of the work was up front. Most of the work was the first couple weekends in spring, getting everything in the ground, getting everything planted, and then it's I spent more time, I think, just smoking a joint and just staring at shit than I spent doing anything else other than harvesting and weeding occasionally. And so I would say that, especially if you're using sheet mulching, the most work is up front, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Mulch makes a big difference, keeps the weeds down, minimizes the need for watering, all that good stuff.
Yeah, it really depends on how crazy your weeds are. Also, if your plants are getting choked out, you're gonna have a little more upkeep.
Yeah. So if you don't have an existing, actually, scratch that. Okay. I'm going to go back to talking about annuals versus perennials for a second.
Okay.
So I usually advocate growing tons of perennials, but this year I would recommend planting more annuals, because a lot of perennials don't really produce in their first year. They're kind of just getting going that first year, and you don't really take any harvest till year 2 or 3. There are a few perennials that I would recommend that are really quick off the bat, and those would be Turkish Rocket, which kind of has a mustard greens flavor, and then in second year and beyond, the flower buds are a lot like broccoli rabe, so that one's really nice, damn near indestructible, really easy to grow, very resilient. So I would recommend that one for a first year garden. Also, stinging nettles are so fast and prolific and nutrient dense that I think they're a great option. But I would recommend planting a bunch of annuals this year, just so you get something that is going to have a good return in the first year.
Oh, you know what? I'll just jump in and say other perennial vegetables that I think are that kick ass, especially the first year, are anything garlic, chivy, spring onions, anything in that family of garlic, chives, mouse garlic.
Nice.
Your mouse garlic that I got from you came up before my garlic chives or regular chives. I was shocked at how fast that is to come up the next year. But it's those are great because it's you can just keep cutting from spring onions and garlic chives and things like that throughout the year. And then next year they come back huge and just, and it's, I don't know. I'm a big fan of having tons and tons of garlic chives. They just get me pumped.
Yeah. Alliums in general are delicious and fun to grow. Right. So that's a good point.
Just throwing it out there, I always got a stump for the perennials, man. Or stan, as the kids say.
All right. So Once you've figured out what you'd like to grow and gotten some seeds going, or seeds, well, I'm going to start again. Once you've figured out what you would like to grow, you need to acquire some seeds for that crop. I sell a lot of seeds for perennial vegetables. There's many sources for annuals. Fedco is a local co-op company around here that has great prices, great selection. They're a little bit aimed towards northern growers. So if you're in the South, probably look for a more local seed company because you'll probably have better results with those varieties. Once you've got seeds in hand, there are probably some things you should be starting indoors, which requires some sort of potting soil, basically whatever you can get your hands on, some sort of container. I would just use whatever comes to hand easily. So plastic, recycled plastic containers with a hole drilled in the bottom so it drains. It's totally fine. You don't need any sort of specialized pot. You'll need a fair amount of light and warmth to grow seedlings indoors. I, for many years, only grew with natural light, but that does require a basically unobstructed south-facing window. So if you don't have that, you'll need some sort of lights to start seedlings indoors if you want to or need to do that. And often the make or break thing with lights, it almost doesn't matter what kind of lights they are, but proximity makes a huge difference. So if you have like a light on the ceiling and you're trying to grow seedlings on a table or something, that is not going to work. But if you have like a fluorescent shop light that's hanging from chains, that you can have like a couple inches above your seedlings, that'll work awesome. There's lots of LED grow lights available now that are pretty cheap and work nicely. And again, proximity really makes a big difference. So you want those lights really quite close to the seedlings, not like touching, but between 2 and 6 or 8 inches from the seedlings is going to help a lot.
Yeah, I've been using these 45-watt light ver LED lights that I got online that are very cheap and take up almost no electricity. So that's what I've had a lot of luck with, doing it like 6 inches above.
Nice. So that's pretty accessible. Also, you can buy seedlings if that makes more sense for you. Pretty much anywhere around the U.S., there's usually someone growing seedlings for sale. And if you have any trouble finding them locally, look up your local cooperative extension, which is an aspect of most public university systems that exists basically to help people with gardening and food preservation questions, and they'll definitely be able to help you get started. Also, just a great resource if you have any gardening questions and need someone to ask. That's a great place to go for that.
Agreed.
All right. So once you've got your seeds in hand that you're going to direct sow, or you've grown or sourced some seedlings that you want to start, something that you can look up online is what's called your last frost date. And that's sort of it's a piece of climate data that tells you basically like what date you're not going to get, or you're very unlikely to get another frost after. And that's when it's safe to plant out your transplants, because they're going to be kind of tender. and that's like kind of when you would want to have all of your first round of crops planted. There are several early spring crops that you can plant as soon as the soil melts and drains. So, for instance, peas, if you look at that chart that I was talking about in the Fedco seed catalog, it says when to plant as soon as possible. So we'll probably be planting peas in like a week or two here. They're usually the first crop to get direct sown. So that's a nice one to get started with.
So, let me just cut you off. I almost put shit in the ground last week because it was so fucking warm. I was like, man, I'm just fucking gonna go for it. And
I was tempted to do that as well.
But and then it just snowed a day later, and now there's snow on the ground again.
Yeah.
So I don't know that. It's like
that snowstorm was a little frustrating.
Yeah, it's like, how do you know? I mean, like because it's like with global. I mean, my thing is I always bet on global warming. Like, oh, that's the last frost day. All right, I'm gonna beat it by 2 weeks, and I always end up eating shit as a result. Like I just killed a bunch of kale by putting.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, global warming is not a great term because it sounds so nice.
Right.
It's just a gentle warming.
Extreme climate. Extreme weather.
Disruption, I think, is a key word because we've had some wild cold spells in the past 5 years where we get like polar vortex and stuff. So it's impossible to really predict the weather, but you can make an educated guess.
And yeah, again, and that's why I really I like growing in protected environments in these like weird times and in these weird climates. I tried to build a greenhouse, it blew away, and then I just threw a low tunnel over, just basically like put PVC pipes through the frame and then just put bricks over some plastic and just kept all the stuff that was there alive. And then now everything under it is just doing amazing. Like I'm about to have those Colette things, a whole shitload of them, various kales,
nice,
peas and kale that I had planted last year are now like just coming up strong. And so I think, just to complicate the conversation, like I love how you can extend the growing season using cold frames and protected environments, especially when the weather is so erratic. And if people are interested in that, they should check out Elliot Coleman's 4 Seasons Harvest. Like I bought that book before I came here, and I wish I had it in Denver. It would have really informed my my growing a lot.
Yeah, you can do a lot with even real simple low tunnels, quick hoops, cold frames. Yeah, they really give you an edge.
Just some windows on bricks over the soil, to be honest. I mean, I had to do that last year because I just didn't want the chickens to tear apart my Turkish rockets, but it actually worked. So, anyway.
Yeah, nice.
Anyway.
So eventually you're going to need somewhere in the ground, hopefully, to grow all this stuff. And the first place that I would look, assuming that you have some sort of yard that you're working with, is to your sort of landscape beds. If there are any gaps in the landscaping or plants that you want to remove and have vegetables or perennial vegetables or something edible, it's a lot easier to convert a landscape bed, especially if it's like mulched and not super weedy, to a productive garden bed than it is to convert lawn or sort of bare soil. So you can plant directly into most landscaped beds. A lot of times the soil is pretty terrible. So if you can amend with some compost, that's great. If you don't have access to compost, then I would recommend fertilizing with diluted urine, which is obviously something that everyone has access to. And I would dilute that between 5 and 10 times with water. So like 1 part urine to 5 to 10 parts water. And that's going to really add a lot of soluble nutrients to any garden. And that'll be especially important if you're kind of working with sort of beat up soil or soil that is really lacking nutrients.
Right on. Or, I mean, of course, it's usually pretty easy to find some leaves, but I suppose they wouldn't be as readily available as the urine, huh? As far as the nutrients go.
Yeah. Leaves are excellent mulch and will break down over time. But you're not going to get a lot of nutrient availability from them like right off the bat. And urine is full of really soluble nutrients, so it's there like immediately. So leaves are definitely, if you've got them, an excellent mulch, and they'll help keep down weeds. They'll help keep soil moist. They'll add nutrients over time, build better quality soil over time. Definitely a good idea. And for the short term, I think urine is pretty much where it's at.
Did you ever see that movie Collapse?
I have not.
Well,
I think that would give me more anxiety than I need right now.
Well, he was talking about peak oil, so he was like, he's way off. Peak oil's quite now. But his whole thing was like, his number one thing was like, insulate your house and piss in your yard. Don't piss in the toilet. You got to piss in your yard. I mean, he was like some former CIA guy who just saw the collapse of the United States as like a foregone conclusion. But his like main thing was like, piss in your yard.
Keep those nutrients on site.
Yeah. So, I'm just saying,
Yeah, I can get with that.
Yeah.
All right. So one more point, just to kind of put it out there for people who are new to gardening and thinking about getting a new garden started, is this idea of sheet mulching. Sheet mulching is kind of revolutionary to a lot of people's ideas of gardening, because it really works quite well, and a huge amount of labor.
Yeah.
With what a lot of people find kind of off-putting or hard to do is like this large investment of labor. The basic idea of sheet mulching is that it's a way to convert lawn, sod, weeds, any sort of unwanted plant material to a garden space really easily. And what you do is you cut down all the unwanted plant material. You can basically just leave it in place, and then you cover it with some sort of sheet layer, and that's usually cardboard or at least 7 layers of newspaper. I personally like cardboard. I find it works really well. There is some labor involved in tearing off any plastic tape or plastic labels that are on it. And the larger the boxes or pieces of cardboard that you're using, the easier it is.
And you really have to do that. I've like not done it ever, and every fucking one of my yards just has like, plastic tape blowing all over the place, and it just sucks. So you have to take the plastic off. you have to
Yeah.
take the tape off.
You want to invest that time up front, which, if you're home, quarantined by yourself or with loved ones, now's the perfect time to, round up some cardboard, some Amazon boxes or whatever, and start peeling off all that tape.
Yeah, I used to, in this neighborhood, I used to just drive around on trash day and take everybody's cardboard boxes.
Okay, so sourcing cardboard right now, because it sounds like coronavirus only lasts about a day on cardboard, it's a relatively safe material to handle. So you can, pick up a bunch from your neighbor's recycling potentially and just kind of stash it for a couple days, wash your hands when you're done, and that might be a good option. If you're particularly concerned, you might be able to ask your neighbors to just leave whatever cardboard they want to get rid of outside with a rock on top of it so it doesn't blow away, and then go and grab it after a day or two when the potential for any coronavirus on that material is basically down to nothing.
Yeah, and I just let family and friends and people know, like, hey, I need hella cardboard. Like, hold on to any cardboard you get.
Yeah.
And do you care if it's got print?
There's a lot of cardboard around.
Yeah. Do you care if it has print or color on it, or like
I don't really care about printing.
Yeah, somebody was complaining about like arsenic in colored ink. We're saying that's a thing. I don't know if that's really true though.
Yeah, I've never seen that from a reliable source. But, if you can easily avoid that, I would. Often color printing on cardboard is like printed on a glossy paper that you can just tear off and put in the recycling separately, and then you've got cardboard without that. I certainly would rather not have that, but if that's what you got to work with, then that's what you got.
Right on.
Similarly, for newspaper, like I like to use the newsprint and not so much the like glossy advertising portion of the newspaper. Also, if you're going to use newspaper, I highly recommend getting it wet first because it tends to blow away really easily. So once as you're laying out your sheet layer, you want to make sure that all the edges overlap. It's especially important if you're using small pieces. And then you need some sort of material to cover the sheet layer, and that just basically prevents it from blowing away. And that material could be hay, straw, wood chips, tree leaves are probably my favorite, seaweed, basically any sort of dead plant material that comes to hand. We actually we made a video of you doing your method of sheet mulching. So if people want to see more, want to see how you do sheet mulching, we can embed that video onto the blog post for this so that people can see it, because the way you show it in that video is a lot simpler than the way I've seen it written about in books and stuff. Cool. Yeah, let's definitely embed that. And once you've got a sheet layer and some mulch on top of it, a lot of people will say, "Oh, and now you leave it for a season and let that sheet layer, smother out the weeds underneath it, and when you come back, it will be, this beautiful soil underneath," which is generally true. But you can also just punch holes in it and plant right away. If you're planting into a sheet mulch that's really fresh, something that does help a lot is having some amount of finished compost to add. And if you've got a lot of finished compost, that's awesome. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But even if you just have like, a bag of finished compost that you have to work with, the way that I would recommend making a little bit of compost go as far as possible is you sheet mulch the area you want to convert to garden, and then for every transplant, for every little baby plant you want to put into that garden, you dig a hole that's at least twice as big as the plant you're putting into it, and then fill the extra space with a handful of compost. And compost is a great source of macro and micronutrients and soil humus, so like just kind of soil carbon. But really the most important thing that you're getting from compost is soil biology. So even just a handful, there's not that much nutritional value to one handful of compost, but the bacteria and fungi that are in there that will help to colonize the plant root system and the soil around that root system is really helpful. So just even a handful in the planting hole with transplants can be super helpful.
Well, can I just cut you off and ask a question then? Do you think like if I was in that boat, I would like throw a bunch of leaves down at the bottom and then put compost on top and then put the plant on top of that? Would you say that that's a good thing to do, or would you say to just not fuck around with the leaves and just stick with the compost?
Yeah, I would do that if you have a good amount of finished compost to work with. But if you don't, I wouldn't try and be planting into leaf material unless it's pretty well broken down.
Okay.
Just because it tends to have a lot of like air spaces in it, and it'll dry out too easily. You could put down a layer of leaves or rotten wood or any sort of organic material like that, and then cover it with some compost, and then put your sheet layer on, and you could plant into that very nicely.
Awesome.
So if you do have access to bulk finished compost, which around here costs about $35 a yard, with a yard being a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot cube. If you can buy a yard or two of finished compost, then you can actually do sheet mulching in what I call an upside down sheet mulch, where you put your sheet layer right on the ground and then you cover it with 4 to 6 or even more if you've got a lot of compost, inches of compost. And that kind of gives you an instant vegetable garden, because you can plant direct sown rows of whatever you want right into that compost layer. And by the time the roots reach down into the soil, the sheet layer will basically be mush, and the roots will be able to go right through that sheet layer and into the soil below it. And I've had really good luck making new vegetable garden beds like that. So, awesome. And then of course on top of that compost layer, you want some sort of mulch layer of the hay, straw, leaves, that type of material. So, the only real downside. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
No, I was just gonna say just as like a point is that it's a lot more cost effective to buy it to seek out a local company that produces compost and sells it by the yard, because typically they will deliver it all to you if you order the minimum order, which is usually like 3 yards or something, and they'll deliver it all to you. And if you don't have a truck like me, that saves you hella time, and you save yourself a bunch of money, because every time you go to whatever Home Depot or whatever and get like the fancy mushroom compost, because if you want compost, you're probably going to want organic stuff, and that stuff is not cheap at places like Home Depot. It's like oftentimes between $6 and $9 for a bag that doesn't get you very far. And so it's like, if you're going to be gardening, you're better off to buy it in bulk. Spend $150, but have a fucking truck full of it.
Yeah, totally. And another thing that makes bulk local compost substantially better is that once you put compost in a sealed plastic bag, you're basically suffocating all the living organisms in there, which are arguably the most important aspect of that compost. So once it's bagged up, it's like dying. And once it, gets shipped around and makes it to a Lowe's or a Home Depot, a lot of the biology is dead. So whenever possible, I like to buy bulk. And if that's available in your area and you can afford to make that upfront investment, I think it's a really good way to spend $100, if that's something you can pull off. If not, you can definitely still grow a perfectly good garden without that. But it's a nice shortcut to having good soil to use, a heavy dose of compost in year one. And adding more compost in future years, it's always great, but you'll never need that much again. And you can often get away with adding little or no compost in future years, especially if you're, always keeping a mulch layer on there and, hopefully adding some diluted urine as well.
Yeah. And developing a practice of composting in general.
Yes. Obviously compost, can be made at home, and, we'll probably talk about that at some point in a future episode. But for a home composter, a couple yards of compost is years and years of accumulated kitchen waste and garden waste.
It's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, and you got to cover that shit so the raccoons don't get it. So.
Yes.
All right. So we got our plot. We got our sheet mulch. Got our plants in there.
Yeah. So, a couple things that I probably should have said earlier about where to put your garden, is there's a few things that plants, need that are fairly obvious, but worth mentioning. Sunlight being a huge one. For any annual vegetables, they're going to grow the best in, full unobstructed sun. Perennials and leaf vegetables, generally speaking, will grow pretty well in part shade. They're never going to be as productive as if they were in full sun. But if part shade is what you got, then work with what you got. And if you don't have any even part shade and you're really restricted as far as sun, then you're going to be really restricted as far as what plants are going to be able to be productive in that kind of environment. So hosta does really well, like amazingly well in shade. And also the perennial vegetable Hablitzia can also be pretty productive in a shady environment.
And just for people who don't know what Hablitzia is, it's a perennial spinach that grows, whatever, six feet every year, and pretty much produces salad greens just constantly throughout the whole year. So it's that plant. Aaron, you're one of the main distributors of that, growers of that seed in North America, but
Yep.
It's delicious. I mean, I don't know why this plant isn't like on everyone's tongue, because it's fucking awesome.
Yeah, I really like Hablitzia. Probably my favorite leaf vegetable, and definitely one that I advocate growing. For me, it grows super easy. I know the further south you go, it gets trickier and trickier. So maybe not, amazing for folks like on the Gulf Coast or something. But you got lots of other cool stuff that you can grow that I can't. But for those northern states, highly recommend Hibblitzia.
Yeah, you can have your lemon trees. We'll have our Hibblitzia.
So plants also need water. That should be fairly obvious. And if you're paying for city water and having some sort of rain catchment system is always nice. The simplest version of that is just 5-gallon buckets lined up along the drip edge of a roof. And whenever it rains, they'll fill up, and you can, water from there as much as possible to avoid paying for city water. City water is also almost always treated with chlorine or chloramine, which is not awesome for that soil biology that you're wanting to foster and help along, because it provides so much nutrition to the plants. So anytime that you can use captured rainwater instead, that's awesome. Also, if you are using city water, see about getting a separately metered water supply. Because a lot of what you're paying for with city water is actually sewer. So when you pay for your water, you're also paying for that water to go away. If you're using water on your garden, a lot of water districts or water companies will charge you substantially less for the water that goes onto the garden, because you're not, in that case, paying for it to go to the wastewater treatment plant or whatever.
Damn.
So if you're going to be gardening on city water, definitely look into that. And that might be something that, can't happen right now because of coronavirus. The city water district guy might just, be like, all right, yeah, call me back in 3 months. But, something to think about in the future.
Yeah. And, one thing I'll just throw in there, you might hate this, but, is in Colorado, because the sun was so brutal, I'd had to water like twice a day. And so I just got like a $20 automated watering system with those plastic irrigation lines running through my yard, and like all in, I think I spent like $70 or something on all the little trinkets and shit. But I wasted a shit ton of water, but I definitely grew a lot. And so if you're like, if you're kind of lazy and don't want to spend too much time watering or whatever, those automated watering systems are very easy to set up. And I think maybe the smarter thing to do is to get the drip irrigation and like bury them in the soil so that you're not, losing a bunch of water to the air.
Yeah, definitely a good point. Drip irrigation is the most efficient use of water as far as irrigation goes. And the drip irrigation lines don't necessarily need to be buried. They can be sort of on the soil surface, but covered with mulch. Is a good way to do that.
Oh, nice. Cool. Awesome. And then the only thing left to do is invite your friends over and share a feast.
If only it's that simple. There's definitely some waiting. There's some waiting involved too.
Oh, man.
But that waiting can be surprisingly short sometimes. There are some crops that have a really short turnaround, like radishes. Radishes are usually from the day you plant them to the day you harvest can be as short as like 25 days. Baby greens are similar to that. You can plant a bed of baby greens and be harvesting in 3 weeks ish, and then you just leave behind some plants untouched, and those will turn into a full head of lettuce, or a full plant of kale or whatever it is you're growing.
Hey, let me cut you off. So you don't pull mini leaves off of your plants that you intend to keep? Because I was always under the assumption that if I pull a leaf off of a kale, it like stimulates that plant to grow more. That's kind of like what I understood about plants like kale.
So you can be harvesting from like if you've got a bed of kale or whatever. I tend to try and leave like the nicest looking seedlings, just kind of leave them alone and let them grow for later, while I'm cutting or pulling some young ones to eat now. Also, like a lot of times, if I planted something too densely, I need to thin it out. I'll wait until the plants that are getting thinned out aren't like tiny little sprouts. They're a little bit more substantial, so that there's an early harvest there, where I'm eating the thinnings and leaving alone the nicest looking or best spaced ones for later.
Yeah, and people also do that with carrots.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I mean, like I feel like those, like I'm trying to think, like that's the basic stuff. I mean, is there other finer details that people planting their garden for the first time that they should be considering?
I don't know. I mean, there probably are. There's a lot to gardening, but I think that's a good baseline to get people kind of thinking about, like, okay, this is the basic idea. And there's a lot of good info out there to kind of deepen and broaden that knowledge. And maybe sometime soon we can do another episode of like basic garden care.
Yeah, and observation. One of the most one of the key permaculture principles is observation. Like you just watch and learn. It's magic unfolding before your eyes. And so it's I don't know. Mainly observation is really, because every yard is different, every person is different, everyone's needs are different. I really liked what Joseph Lofthouse said in the interview that we're probably going to drop next week. Was like, grow the stuff you love.
Yeah, I thought that was really awesome.
Yeah, because it's like you're gonna want to go out there, and so it's like for me this year, I'm just thinking tomatoes, onion, like spring onions, potatoes, and kale. That's gonna be my life. That's what when capitalism rebounds on Easter, I'll still be eating potatoes and kale. So,
that sounds pretty good.
Yeah, not that I'll have any by then. Well, shit, man. Yeah, I don't know. So, I mean, any last thoughts on this, or should we just leave it open for questions? If if you're trying this stuff, if you do this, one thing I'll add about the sheet mulching thing is like, it's a little bit of work up front, far less work than weeding and digging. And I can definitely attest to the fact that like you leave that cardboard on for a year and then underneath it, it's smothered out the weeds and you're able to just plant right into it in the future. And so that's it's like, even if it's just the first step is, sheet mulching, it's, it's way better than tilling and, just all the work that goes into tilling, because when you till the soil, you're bringing up, well, you're like wiping out so much of the microorganisms, and you're exposing all these seeds that are just going to turn into weeds again. And so sheet mulching is really in my experience, the best way to plant a garden. Unless, unless you're like, but even like we did over here, it's like I did sheet mulching and then I cut in the middle, and that's where I planted my carrots, and it fucking worked perfect. Like I got hella carrots, hella parsnips, planting right through the sheet mulch. So
yeah, it's a great technique. There's no one thing that works for every situation. So really steep slopes often don't work well for sheet mulching. It's really difficult, but not impossible, to sheet mulch out quackgrass or Japanese knotweed. But for 99 times out of 100, it's what I would recommend for starting a new garden space. I did have one thought of something that might be kind of fun to do, which is to offer a Q&A conference call. So maybe if this drops tomorrow, maybe like Monday evening or something, we could both jump on Jitsi and have a link for that in the show notes. And if people wanted to hop on that conference call and ask questions about, their basic gardening questions and have that kind of interactive conversation, that might be kind of fun.
That'd be fucking awesome. Let's plan on that. I'll create the Jitsi room right now, and we'll just throw it up there. What time? Like 7 p.m. on Monday?
Yes, that sounds great.
7 p.m. EST. Cool.
Yep.
Great idea. So
cool. You
heard it here first. If folks are out there wanting to start gardens and want to hop on a conference call with us on Monday, how to do it, we're going to create a little Propaganda by the Seed Jitsi room, and we'll see you there. And if you have any other questions for us, you can pop me an email, sole@soleone.org, and you can hit up Aaron at
Edgewood Landscapes with an S on the end of it at gmail.com.
All right, y'all. Happy. Well, I don't know. I can't say happy anything right now because shit's fucked up. So
just try not to get too stressed out, and you're probably going to make it through just fine.
Yeah, and hey, no better relief of stress that I know of. Well, there's a couple, but gardening is at the top. So
it's a good one.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, have a good day. See you around.
Yep.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening. Thanks for giving a shit, and thanks for supporting our work. And good luck out there.
After the 2016 election, a lot of us woke up to some harsh realities. In the aftermath of dark events, I came back to political work with a new sense of urgency. But after a few months of showing up to protest every weekend, I started to burn out. It didn't feel like anything was changing. In fact, maybe things were even getting worse. And it got me thinking, what comes next? Rebel Steps is a podcast about what comes next. You'll hear episodes on letter writing to political prisoners, practicing mutual aid, and creating political art. You'll hear the voices and stories of my community in New York City, spotlighting a range of organizers from the Metropolitan Anarchist Coordinating Council, NYC Books Through Bars, Anarchist Black Cross, Lower Manhattan Food Not Bombs, brand workers, and more. I'll walk you through what you can do to start plugging into movements and learning organizing skills step by step. If you've been to a march or two and you're looking to jump in, this podcast is for you. Or if you have friends looking for more, pass it on. Listen at rebelsteps.com, on iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts.